interpretation of what complicating means compared to Dr. Baker, for example.
Yes.
And there's a reasonable degree of disagreement amongst, in any case generally, it's reasonable for doctors to disagree with each other, is it not?
That sometimes happens, yes.
All right. You did not perform the actual autopsy of Mr. Floyd, correct?
Correct.
And that was Dr. Baker who did that, right?
Yes.
And you know Dr. Baker well?
Yes.
And you know him to be a competent medical examiner?
Yes.
Right. He's the chief medical examiner for Hennepin County at this time?
Yes.
Now, you were provided again with all of the information from his report, and I would like to go through a few of the things with you. Let's talk about Mr. Floyd's heart first.
Okay.
What was the size of Mr. Floyd's heart as measured at autopsy?
The weight of Mr. Floyd's heart was 540 grams.
And would you explain or would you describe that as an enlarged heart?
I would say it's a slightly enlarged heart, yes.
Okay. And there are some different measures of how to base an enlarged heart or how to determine if a heart is enlarged, right?
Right. By some categories, that heart would not be considered enlarged.
So there's two, as I understand it, two different kind of primary measurements or primary ways of comparing Mr. Floyd's heart to determine if it's enlarged, right? The Molina studies and the Northwestern studies.
Oh, I see. There's probably multiple ways of looking at heart weights. I mean, those are two of them. There's the study from the Mayo Clinic. There's one in Europe. There's lots of ways of analyzing.
But ultimately, based on all of your information, you would agree that Mr. Floyd's heart was slightly enlarged, right?
Yes.
In terms of the DeMaio and Molina standard, what would a normal male heart weigh for a person similar to Mr. Floyd?
Oh, I don't know off the top of my head.
Would you disagree if I said it was 383 grams?
That well could be.
Okay.
For the average, I mean.
For the average, right.
Yeah.
So according to, if that were the average heart rate, or heart size, excuse me, heart weight, 383 grams, relevant to Mr. Floyd's heart would be considered profoundly enlarged.
Well, the thing about using averages in especially medicine, which is of course what I'm most familiar with, is we don't generally just compare it to an average. We usually compare it to an average plus or minus 2 standard deviations. So that's why the range that I usually use is, from 253 to 510 grams would be the range of normal for someone of Mr. Floyd's height. And so I don't know in the DeMaio Molina study what their 2 standard deviations would be. Okay. But I wouldn't use just the average.
Okay, and so in terms of how you would assess the weight or size of the heart, you would say 510 grams is the high, 510 grams is the high end?
Right.
Of that, and 540 exceeds that, right?
Right.
And so in terms of whether it's a very enlarged heart or even a relatively minimally enlarged heart, a larger heart requires more blood, right?
Yes, it has greater demand, yes.
What are some of the things that cause a person to have an enlarged heart?
Probably the primary cause is high blood pressure.
You understand, based on Mr. Floyd's medical records, that he did in fact have a history of high blood pressure, correct?
Yes.
Can you describe the blood vessels of the heart?
There are several major coronary arteries that, as I mentioned, supply blood and nutrients to the heart muscle. There's the left and right, and then the left branches into the left anterior descending and the left circumflex And then there's some other ranges off that.
And how would you describe narrowing or stenosis of the coronary arteries?
So the way we as forensic pathologists describe it is we look at the opening. So if an opening is fully open, then that would be 0% narrowing. And if it's completely closed, then that would be 100% occluded. And so then we look at anything ranging from, 25, 50, 75, 90%. Obviously, it's just an eyeball estimation. We don't actually get out calipers and measure because the actual percentage doesn't really matter. It's more, did they have coronary artery disease? Was it pretty good, pretty bad? That sort of thing.
Can you describe the difference between proximal and distal narrowing?
The way the coronary arteries supply blood to the heart, they come off of the aorta, which is the main vessel that takes blood from the heart to the rest of the body. And so in close to the aorta is called proximal to the aorta, and then the further out it goes, distributing blood along the way to the heart muscle is called distal.
And when you have proximal narrowing, how does that affect the heart?
It can narrow the blood supply to more of the heart than if you have distal narrowing.
Another way of saying that would be it decreases the amount of blood the heart is getting, right?
Yes.
And it also affects how things are removed from the heart, right? Like CO2, carbon dioxide.
Well, that's different.